Fort McClellan, Alabama. Summer, 1944. In the humid, pine-scented air of the American South, a strange and paradoxical scene unfolds daily within the confines of a prisoner of war camp. German women, captured auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, file into the mess hall, their faces a mixture of resignation, defiance, and a creeping, unspoken curiosity. On their metal trays, alongside slices of bread and a piece of fruit, is a steaming, white, viscous substance that looks to their eyes like wallpaper paste or perhaps something boiled for livestock. In the early days, they had given it a name, whispered with derisive laughter: Schweinfutter. Pig feet. They had mocked it, poked it with their spoons, and pushed it away, a symbolic rejection of their captors' culture, a culture they had been taught was weak, decadent, and inferior. Yet, months later, the scene has changed. The mockery has faded, replaced by a quiet ritual. These same women, their expressions now softened by a reality that had systematically dismantled their worldview. Add a pat of butter or a sprinkle of salt to the white mound. Some even line up for a second helping. They asked for it. Daily. They had learned its name was not Schweinfutter, but grits. They had laughed at this simple, humble food, this porridge of ground corn that held no place in the pantheon of European cuisine. They laughed until the day they truly tasted it, and in doing so, tasted something far more potent, an unexpected and world-altering form of humanity. What could possibly happen within the wire fences of an enemy camp to transform ideological contempt into daily comfort? How could a bowl of boiled corn help unravel the most powerful propaganda machine the world had ever seen? This is the story of that transformation. Before we uncover the profound truth hidden within that simple American meal, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. To understand the miracle of the grits, we must first journey back across the war-torn Atlantic to the heart of the Third Reich, and into the mind of a young woman named Anneliese. Anneliese was not a monster. She was a product of her time, an intelligent and observant woman who had been fed a steady diet of ideology from childhood. She had seen Germany rise from the ashes of humiliation, reborn in a fire of nationalism that promised 1,000 years of glory. She believed in the cause, in the inherent superiority of her people, and in the existential threat posed by the world outside. The Americans, she was taught, were a mongrel nation of capitalists and gangsters, a culture so shallow and materialistic that it would crumble at the first sign of real hardship. They lacked the discipline, the history, the iron will that defined her homeland. Their soldiers were not warriors, but spoiled boys sent to die for bankers. This was the lens through which she saw the world, a lens polished daily by radio broadcasts, by films, by the pronouncements of a leader she had been conditioned to revere as a savior. When she was captured in the chaos of the collapsing front in France, her first emotion was not relief, but terror. Terror born not of what she had seen, but of what she had been told. The journey across the ocean in the belly of a transport ship was a descent into a nightmare of her own imagination. She and the other women, packed together in the dim light, whispered stories of the horrors that awaited them. American POW camps, the propaganda had insisted, were places of starvation, torture, and re-education through brutal humiliation. They would be treated as subhuman, their dignity stripped away by their decadent and cruel captors. Anneliese steeled herself for the worst. She expected snarling guards, barren huts, and the gnawing pain of hunger. As the ship docked and she first set foot on American soil, she looked not for a welcoming shore, but for the first signs of the barbarism she knew was coming. The very air felt alien, thick with a humidity her body had never known. The world she had been taught to hate was now her home, and she prepared her soul for a battle of attrition, a fight to hold on to her beliefs in the face of the enemy's inevitable cruelty. She had her pride, her identity, and the certainty that everything she knew was the truth. She had no idea that all of it, every last conviction, was about to be challenged not by a weapon or a fist, but by a simple, profound, and undeniable act of kindness, served warm in a bowl. Her indoctrinated mind was a fortress, but its foundations were about to be washed away by a tide of quiet decency she could never have anticipated. The first crack in that foundation appeared the moment she stepped off the truck. The arrival at Fort McClellan was not the chaotic scene of torment Annalise had braced herself for. There was no gauntlet of spitting, hateful civilians, no snarling dogs straining at their leashes. Instead, there was a quiet, almost bureaucratic orderliness that was in itself deeply unsettling. The American soldiers who processed them were tall and looked impossibly well fed, but their faces were not masks of cruelty. They looked young, some of them barely out of their teens, and their expressions were a mixture of curiosity and a kind of weary professionalism. They were led to a series of long, wooden barracks, simple but sturdy and cleanly swept. The Alabama sun beat down on the red earth, and the scent of pine was everywhere. This was the first contradiction. The camp was not a pit of despair, but a place of clean lines and ordered calm. Inside the barracks, another shock awaited them. Rows of metal cots stood in neat alignment, each with a folded blanket and a thin mattress. But it was at the end of the long room that the women saw something that made them stop and stare in disbelief. A row of pristine, white porcelain toilets, each with its own flushing mechanism. In a Germany where even in fine city apartments such conveniences were not universal, and where the front lines meant primitive latrines, this was a display of casual, almost decadent, luxury. Helga, a staunch and vocal party loyalist who had appointed herself the guardian of the group's morale, was the first to speak. "A trick," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "They want to soften us, make us forget who we are. It is a psychological game." Annalise heard her, but her own mind was struggling to reconcile this reality with her expectations. A trick? Perhaps, but it seemed an awfully elaborate one. Their processing continued. They were given bars of soap that smelled faintly of lavender and told to shower. Hot water streamed from the taps, another unimaginable luxury. They were issued clean, simple cotton dresses to replace their worn uniforms. The American woman supervising the process, a member of the Women's Army Corps, was stern but not unkind. She demonstrated how to use the facilities, her movements efficient, her tone matter of fact. There was no humiliation, no taunting. There was only process. It was in this state of profound cognitive dissonance that Annalise first saw Sergeant Miller. He was not a commandant or an officer of high rank, but a supply sergeant, a man whose domain was the camp's warehouses and kitchens. He was older than the other guards, perhaps in his 40s, with lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. He oversaw the distribution of their bedding, counting out blankets with a methodical patience. He did not smile, but his eyes, when they briefly met hers, held no malice. They held a deep, profound weariness, as if he had seen enough of war and wanted only for the whole ugly business to be over. He was the embodiment of this new, confusing reality, not a monster, not a friend, but simply a man doing a job. The environment itself was a constant, silent refutation of everything she had been taught. The propaganda films had shown America as a dust bowl of starving farmers or a grimy landscape of factories spewing black smoke. But from the camp, Annalise could see rolling green hills under a vast blue sky. The air was clean, the trees were vibrant, and the sense of space, of endless, untroubled land, was overwhelming. It did not look like a nation on the brink of collapse. It looked strong, peaceful, and impossibly vast. That evening, as the women lay on their cots in the unfamiliar darkness, the whispers began. Liesel, a young nurse who had been captured alongside Annalise, voiced the question that was on everyone's mind. "Did you see the toilets? And the soap?" Helga was quick to shut her down. "They are trying to buy our loyalty with trinkets. Do not be fooled by their material wealth. It is a sign of their spiritual emptiness. Remember what they are doing to our cities, to our families. This is a golden cage." Annalise lay silent, listening to the crickets outside the window. A golden cage. The phrase had the ring of propaganda to it, a neat, tidy explanation for a reality that was anything but. She had expected a cage of iron and filth. She had been prepared to fight that. But how did one fight a cage made of cleanliness, order, and hot water? She felt a deep, unsettling confusion, a sense that the world was not as black and white as she had believed. The fortress of her certainty had been breached, not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable evidence of her own senses. The real assault, however, would begin the next morning, not with an interrogation or a punishment, but with breakfast. The clanging of the mess hall bell was a harsh, metallic sound in the quiet dawn. The German women were marched in formation to a large hall filled with long wooden tables and benches. The air inside smelled of coffee, baked bread, and something else, something unfamiliar, a warm, slightly earthy scent that Annalise couldn't place. They shuffled down the serving line, metal trays in hand. American GIs, prisoners themselves of the monotonous kitchen duty, slapped food onto their plates with practiced indifference. A scoop of scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, a ladleful of something. It was a thick, steaming, white porridge, almost completely smooth, but with a slightly granular texture. It sat on the tray like a pale, formless island, utterly alien to their German palates accustomed to dark, dense rye bread, cold cuts, and cheese for the morning meal. A murmur went through the line of women. Was this das? What is that? The question was passed down in whispers, a mixture of genuine curiosity and nascent disgust. It was Helga who gave voice to their collective judgment. Standing in the middle of the hall, she held up her tray for all to see, a look of theatrical contempt on her face. Schweinfutter, she declared, her voice ringing with scorn. They are feeding us pig feed. A wave of nervous, defiant laughter rippled through the German prisoners. It was a moment of unity, a shared release of tension. In mocking this strange, unappetizing food, they were reasserting their own cultural identity, their superiority. They were reminding themselves, and their captors, that they were different, that they were better. They sat down and poked at the white substance with their forks. It had little taste on its own, a faint, corn-like blandness. It was the texture that was most offensive, a soft, slightly gritty mush. One by one, they pushed it to the side of their trays, eating the toast and eggs, but leaving the grits untouched, a small, silent protest. Annalise watched Sergeant Miller, who was supervising the mess hall from near the kitchens. He saw the untouched grits on their trays as they were brought back to be washed. He saw their derisive glances and heard their laughter. Yet, his expression remained unchanged. There was no anger, no flicker of offense. He simply observed, his gaze patient and unreadable. This, more than anything, unnerved Annalise. Their gesture of defiance had been met not with punishment, but with indifference. It was as if their opinion of the food, and by extension, their opinion of their captors, was of no consequence whatsoever. It was a profound and subtle form of power, this complete lack of reaction. The next morning, the grits were there again. And the morning after that. It was part of the standard breakfast, an unchangeable fixture of their new reality. The mockery continued, but with less energy each day. It was hard to maintain a state of high dudgeon when the object of your contempt was so persistent and the purveyors of it so unconcerned. Annalise, ever the observer, began to notice something else. The American guards and staff in the mess hall were eating the exact same food. They would take a large scoop of grits and then proceed to doctor it, adding generous pats of butter that melted into golden pools, stirring in salt and pepper, sometimes a dash of hot sauce or a spoonful of sugar. They ate it with gusto, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They were not being forced to eat it. They chose to. It was their food. The realization was a small but significant blow. The pig feed was not a punishment ration designed for prisoners. It was part of the American diet. To reject the grits was not just to reject a food item. It was to reject the culture of the people who were now in complete control of their lives. It was an act of cultural arrogance they could ill afford, and one that was based, she was beginning to suspect, on a foundation of profound ignorance. Hunger, too, began to exert its influence. The work details were demanding, and the breakfast of toast and eggs was not quite enough to sustain them until lunch. The untouched mound of grits on the tray began to look less like an object of scorn and more like a source of wasted energy, of squandered sustenance. It sat there, a silent challenge to their pride, a warm and waiting testament to the simple, undeniable power of necessity. The fortress of their ideology was being besieged, and the unlikely vanguard of the assault was a humble bowl of boiled corn. The days at Fort McClellan bled into one another, forming a routine that was both monotonous and strangely calming. The initial shock of capture had worn off, replaced by a slow, grinding adjustment to a new kind of existence. The expected horrors never came. There were no beatings, no interrogations under bright lights. Instead, There was work, 3 meals a day, and a pervasive, soul-shaking sense of order. The women were assigned tasks in the camp's laundry, kitchens, and infirmary, or on nearby farms, helping with the harvest. It was through this work that Annalise began to see the true nature of her enemy. It wasn't their cruelty that defined them, but their staggering, almost unbelievable efficiency and abundance. In the laundry, they used enormous washing machines that could handle dozens of sheets at once, powered by electricity that never seemed to fail. In the kitchens, they saw crates of fresh vegetables, sacks of flour, and cuts of meat that spoke of a nation with no concept of rationing. Everything they had been told about a decadent America, weakened by the Great Depression and incapable of sustaining a war effort, was a lie. The evidence was irrefutable, piled high in the warehouses and storerooms. This was a nation of immense, almost casual, power. And every morning, the grits remained. They were the one constant in a world of shifting perceptions. For weeks, the standoff continued. The German women, led by the unyielding Helga, would leave their portions untouched, a small, daily act of defiance. But cracks were beginning to show in their united front. Hunger was a patient and persuasive argument. It was Liesel, the pragmatic young nurse, who capitulated first. One morning, with a sigh of resignation, she picked up her salt shaker and sprinkled a small amount onto her grits. "I am too hungry to be proud," she murmured to Annalise, not meeting her eyes. She took a tentative bite, then another. "It is not so bad," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "It is warm." Helga shot her a look of pure venom from across the table. "You are weak," she spat. "You let them win with a bowl of sludge." Liesel flushed, but did not stop eating. Annalise watched the exchange, her own stomach rumbling. Liesel's simple act of pragmatism felt less like a surrender and more like an acceptance of reality. What was the point of this pride? Who did it serve? It did not feed them. It did not change their circumstances. It was a hollow gesture, a performance for an audience that wasn't even paying attention. Annalise's observations intensified. She watched the American soldiers more closely now, not as a monolithic enemy, but as individuals. She saw them reading letters from home, their faces clouded with worry. She saw them playing baseball in their off hours, their laughter carrying on the humid air. She saw them treat each other with a casual camaraderie that spoke of a different kind of discipline than the rigid, fear-based hierarchy of her own army. They were not the goose-stepping automatons of German newsreels, nor were they the brutish gangsters of the propaganda posters. They were just men, young and far from home, caught in the same vast, impersonal machinery of war as she was. And they ate their grits. They ate them with bacon, with eggs, with syrup. It was their fuel, their comfort, their taste of home. Annalise began to see the food not as an insult, but as an invitation, a shared experience. To eat the grits would not be to surrender her identity, but perhaps to acknowledge a shared humanity, a common ground that existed even between enemies. One day, a small parcel of Red Cross supplies was distributed. Among the items was a small tin of sweetened condensed milk. That evening, Helga used hers to barter for cigarettes. Liesel, however, saved hers. The next morning at breakfast, she carefully opened the tin and drizzled a small amount of the thick, sweet milk over her grits. She offered some to Annalise. Hesitantly, Annalise accepted. She stirred the milk into the warm porridge, watching it swirl and dissolve. She lifted the spoon to her lips and took a bite. It was a revelation. The blandness was gone, replaced by a comforting sweetness. The warmth spread through her, a simple, creature comfort that soothed a part of her she hadn't realized was so tense. It was more than just food. It was a moment of peace, a small pleasure in a world that had been stripped of it. She ate the entire bowl for the first time. Across the table, Helga watched, her face a mask of disapproval. But Annalise did not care. She was tired of being hungry. She was tired of a pride that fed on nothing but its own bitterness. In that bowl of sweetened grits, she had found not a symbol of her defeat, but a symbol of her own will to survive, to adapt, and to find warmth in the coldest of places. The change in Annalise was subtle at first, but it represented a seismic shift in her inner world. The simple act of eating the grits was a declaration of independence from the rigid ideology that had governed her life. It was a choice to trust the evidence of her own senses over the doctrines that had been drilled into her. This newfound perspective began to color all of her experiences within the camp. She started to see not a prison, but a temporary, ordered society, one with its own rules and rhythms that were, for the most part, fair and predictable. The true catalyst, the moment that shattered the last vestiges of her indoctrinated worldview, came not in a grand, dramatic confrontation, but in a small, quiet act of unscripted kindness. A wave of illness had swept through the barracks, a miserable flu that left the women weak and feverish. Annalise, trained as a nurse's aide, worked tirelessly in the infirmary, but eventually, she too succumbed. She lay on her cot for 2 days, shivering with fever, her body aching, and with no appetite for anything. On the third morning, she felt well enough to drag herself to the mess hall, but the thought of food turned her stomach. She sat before her tray, the steam rising from the grits, and felt a wave of nausea. She pushed the tray away, resting her head in her hands, feeling utterly defeated and alone, a sick prisoner thousands of miles from home. It was then that Sergeant Miller appeared at her table. She hadn't even noticed him approaching. He looked down at her, then at her untouched tray. His expression was not one of annoyance or impatience. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she could only describe as paternal concern. He didn't speak. He simply picked up her tray and walked away toward the kitchens. Annalise watched him go, confused. She expected him to simply dispose of it. Helga, from a few seats down, sneered, "See? They will not even let you starve in peace." But a minute later, Sergeant Miller returned. He placed the tray back in front of Annalise. The grits looked different. A generous pat of butter was melting in the center, creating a golden pool. A spoonful of dark molasses had been drizzled over the top, and it had been sprinkled with cinnamon. The aroma was warm and inviting. He pointed to the bowl, then gently pushed it a little closer to her. He gave a single, small nod, and then walked away without a word. Annalise stared at the bowl. This was not part of the standard issue. The butter, the molasses, the cinnamon, these were extras, items from the American kitchen, not the prisoner's ration. This was not official policy. This was a personal act. He had seen her misery, and his response was not to enforce a rule or ignore her plight, but to try and offer a small measure of comfort. It was a gesture so profoundly human, so completely at odds with the image of the brutish, unfeeling enemy, that it broke something open inside her. Tears welled in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness or self-pity, but of overwhelming, confusing gratitude. She picked up her spoon, her hand trembling slightly. She took a small bite. The combination of the warm, creamy grits, the rich butter, the deep sweetness of the molasses, and the fragrant spice of the cinnamon was transformative. It was delicious. It was more than delicious. It was deeply, profoundly comforting. It was the kind of food a mother might make for a sick child. It was medicine for the body and the soul. She ate the entire bowl, slowly, savoring each spoonful. With each bite, she felt the rigid certainties of her past dissolving. How could a man who was supposed to be her enemy perform such a simple, decent act? The propaganda had no answer for this. The ideology had no category for a compassionate sergeant who served spiced grits to a sick prisoner. Helga could call it a trick, a psychological ploy, but Annalise knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones, that it was not. It was real. It was a moment of unadulterated human connection that transcended uniforms, languages, and the hatred of nations. From that day forward, the grits were no longer just food to Annalise. They were a symbol of that moment, a reminder of the quiet, unexpected decency she had found in the heart of her enemy's stronghold. She saw Sergeant Miller in a new light, not as a guard, but as a man, a good man. And she began to ask herself a dangerous and liberating question. If they had been so wrong about him, what else had they been wrong about? Annalise's quiet conversion did not go unnoticed. Her acceptance of the grits, and the story of Sergeant Miller's kindness which she shared with Liesel and a few other trusted friends, began to have a ripple effect. The mess hall, once a theater of unified German scorn, slowly became divided. On one side were Helga and the hardliners, who clung to their contempt as a badge of honor, their untouched bowls of grits a daily testament to their unbroken will. On the other side was a growing faction, led by Annalise's example, who had begun to eat the morning meal, experimenting with salt, sugar, and whatever else they could acquire to make it their own. The grits became a silent referendum on their reality. To eat them was to accept the possibility that their captors were not the monsters of propaganda. To reject them was to cling to the ideological purity of a world that, as news from the front grew grimmer, seemed to be collapsing into ruin. The transformation, however, was about far more than a single food item. The grits were merely the symbol, the daily, tangible evidence of a much larger revelation. Working in the camp's supply depot under Sergeant Miller's supervision, Annalise was confronted with the staggering scale of American material wealth. She saw crates of canned peaches from California, sacks of potatoes from Idaho, barrels of flour from Kansas. She saw tools, machine parts, tires, and textiles in quantities that beggared belief. Germany had been on a total war footing for years, with every scrap of metal and ounce of rubber rationed for the military. Civilians at home were making do with ersatz coffee and bread cut with sawdust. Yet here, in a single POW camp in the middle of a global conflict, was an abundance that would have been unthinkable even in peacetime Germany. She remembered the propaganda films that portrayed America as a nation of breadlines and Hoovervilles. It was a lie, a complete and utter lie. The United States was not a decaying power. It was an industrial titan of unimaginable proportions, a nation that could arm millions of men, fight a war across 2 oceans, and still have enough left over to serve butter with the prisoner's breakfast. This realization was both terrifying and liberating. It was terrifying because it meant the war was utterly, hopelessly lost. Germany could not possibly prevail against such overwhelming might. But it was liberating because it freed her from the obligation to believe. If the leaders had lied about this fundamental reality of their enemy's strength, they had lied about everything. The entire edifice of the Third Reich, with its promises of glory and racial destiny, was built on a foundation of deceit. Annalise discussed these thoughts in hushed tones with Liesel. They told us we were the master race, she whispered one evening in the barracks. But look at them. They build things. They have so much. We have only learned how to destroy. Liesel, who had long since become a grits enthusiast, nodded in agreement. Perhaps strength is not about shouting and marching, Annalise. Perhaps it is about this quiet ability to create. Helga overheard them. You sound like them, she snarled. You have been seduced by their canned peaches and their soft bread. You have forgotten your blood. You have forgotten your honor. But her words had lost their power. They sounded hollow, like echoes from a distant, irrelevant world. Annalise and Liesel no longer feared her judgment. They pitied her. She was a prisoner not just of the Americans, but of a lie, unable to see the world as it was, only as she had been told it should be. The knowledge of America's power did not make Annalise admire its system, not yet. But it instilled in her a profound respect for its capabilities. And it made the daily kindnesses of men like Sergeant Miller all the more significant. A nation this powerful had no need to be kind to its prisoners. It could have been cruel, neglectful, brutal. The fact that it chose, as a matter of policy and personal conduct, to be humane was the most shocking revelation of all. It spoke of a different kind of strength, a moral confidence that was utterly alien to the ideology of her homeland, which saw mercy as weakness and compassion as a flaw. The women learned that the camp was run according to the rules of the Geneva Convention, a document their own leadership had often dismissed as bourgeois sentimentality. Here, it was the law. This respect for rules, for a code of conduct, even in war, was another piece of the puzzle. The decadent Americans, it turned out, had principles they were willing to uphold, even when no one was forcing them to. The grits, in the end, were the perfect metaphor for America itself. On their own, they were plain, humble, and unassuming. But with a little effort, with the addition of other elements, they could be transformed into something nourishing, comforting, and good. It was not a food of arrogance or high culture. It was simple, democratic, and sustaining. It was the food of a people who were practical, not theatrical. And Annalise was beginning to understand that the world would not be won by theatricality, but by the quiet, overwhelming power of simple, practical, and sustained effort. The moment of Annalise's final, public transformation arrived with a fresh shipment of prisoners. A group of women, captured during the final, desperate battles in Germany, were trucked into the camp. They were nothing like Annalise's group, who had been taken earlier in the war. These newcomers were gaunt, their eyes burning with a fanaticism honed by years of total war and the apocalyptic defense of their homeland. They were younger, more deeply indoctrinated, and they viewed the relative comfort of Fort McClellan not with relief, but with suspicion and rage. The next morning in the mess hall was a scene of open hostility. The new prisoners looked at the food on their trays with utter revulsion. When they saw the grits, their reaction was even more extreme than the initial mockery of Annalise's group. One young woman, a fierce-looking blonde who had been a leader in the League of German Girls, stood up, her face twisted in a mask of fury. "I will not eat this garbage," she screamed in German, slamming her tray down on the table. The food spattered, and a hush fell over the hall. "This is not fit for a German soldier. It is an insult to our people." The American guards tensed, their hands moving toward their belts. Sergeant Miller emerged from the kitchen, his face grim. Helga and her faction of skeptics looked on with grim satisfaction, nodding in approval. They finally had allies, fresh blood to reinvigorate their dying protest. It was a pivotal moment, a spark that could have ignited a riot. The authority of the camp was being challenged directly. But before the guards could move, before Sergeant Miller could give a command, Annalise stood up. She moved with a calm and deliberate grace that commanded the attention of the entire room. All eyes, German and American, were on her. She walked not to the guards, but to the table where the furious young woman stood trembling with rage. Annalise looked her directly in the eye, her expression not angry, but filled with a profound and sorrowful understanding. She began to speak in a clear, calm voice, her German words carrying across the silent hall. "I was like you," she began, her voice steady. "When I first came here, I thought the same thing. I looked at this food, and I felt contempt. I thought it was a symbol of their weakness, their lack of culture." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I was wrong." She picked up the spoon from the furious woman's tray. "They have lied to us," she continued, her voice rising with quiet passion. "About everything. They lied about the war. They lied about our enemies. They lied about our own strength." She gestured around the hall, at the well-fed prisoners, at the clean tables, at the American guards who stood watching, confused but holding their positions. "Look around you. Does this look like the actions of a barbaric people? We are their prisoners. They have absolute power over us. They could starve us, beat us, kill us. And yet, they give us clean beds. They give us medicine when we are sick. And they feed us. They feed us their own food." She then turned her attention to the bowl of grits. She took a small scoop onto the spoon. "They told us this was animal feed. This is not true. This is the food of their farmers, their workers, their soldiers. On its own, it is simple, but they have taught us to add to it. A little salt, a little butter." Her eyes flickered towards Sergeant Miller, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "They have shown us how to make it good, how to turn something simple into something that gives strength. This is not poison. It is survival. It is warmth on a cold morning. The greatest lie they told us was that kindness is weakness. Here, in this place, I have learned that it is the greatest strength of all." She held the spoon out to the young woman. "Eat," she said, her voice now gentle. "Eat and live. The war is over. The hatred can be over, too, if you let it." The young prisoner stared at Annalise, her fury draining away, replaced by a look of stunned confusion. The certainty that had sustained her through bombs and battles was cracking under the weight of Annalise's testimony. Slowly, hesitantly, she took the spoon from Annalise's hand. She sat down, and, with the entire mess hall watching, she took her first bite of American grits. The tension in the room broke. The crisis was averted. Helga stared in disbelief, her cause utterly defeated, not by force, but by a quiet speech and a spoonful of porridge. Annalise had not just defended a food, she had defended a newfound truth. She had rejected the old world of hatred and embraced a new one of possibility, becoming a bridge between her own people and their humane captors. In that moment, she was no longer just a prisoner. She was a leader. Annalise's speech in the mess hall marked her definitive break with the past. It was a public declaration of her transformation, and it solidified her status as an informal leader among the prisoners who were ready to accept their new reality. Her decision was no longer just to survive, but to understand. She threw herself into the English classes offered at the camp, her quick mind absorbing the new language with a hunger born of a desire to connect. She started having real conversations, not just with Liesel, but with the American WACs and guards. She asked them about their homes, their families, their hopes for the future after the war. She discovered that their motivations were not so different from those of the young men she had known in Germany. They were not fighting for conquest or racial ideology. They were fighting, as one young guard from Ohio told her, to get the job done and go home. This simple, pragmatic worldview was a revelation. It lacked the grandiose, romantic nihilism of her own culture's war footing, and instead was rooted in a deep-seated desire for peace and normalcy. This, she realized, was why they would win. They were fighting for something tangible, something real. As she learned more, her life in the camp changed. Sergeant Miller, recognizing her intelligence and her role as a peacemaker, gave her more responsibilities in the supply depot. She became an intermediary, a translator who could explain camp rules to the German women and convey their needs to the American administration. She was building a new identity, not as a German auxiliary, but as a facilitator of understanding. Then came the news. On a bright spring day in May of 1945, the camp commandant assembled all the prisoners in the central square. He announced, through a translator, that the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. A strange sound went through the crowd of women. It was not a cheer of relief, nor was it a collective gasp of horror. It was a low, mournful moan, the sound of 1,000 certainties dying at once. They were free, in a sense. The fighting had stopped, but they were also utterly adrift. Their nation was in ruins, their government had ceased to exist, and the ideology for which they had sacrificed everything had been exposed as a murderous fraud. For Helga and the others like her, the news was an unbearable humiliation. They wept with rage, cursing their leaders for their failure. But for Anneliese, the feeling was different. There was sadness, yes, a deep sorrow for the catastrophic loss and the shame her country had brought upon the world. But underneath it, there was a quiet, steady flicker of hope. The end of the war was not just an ending. It was a chance for a beginning. Her time in the American camp had not just been an imprisonment, it had been an education. It had deprogrammed her. She had arrived expecting monsters and had found flawed but decent human beings. She had arrived with a mind full of hatred and had discovered a capacity for empathy and respect. She had arrived as an enemy and had learned the language of reconciliation. The immediate consequences of the war's end were a period of uncertainty. The women waited for news of their repatriation. But in the meantime, the atmosphere in the camp softened. The lines between captor and captive began to blur. The Americans, no longer guards of an active enemy, became custodians of displaced people. They brought in newsreels showing the liberation of the concentration camps. For Anneliese and many others, seeing the skeletal figures, the piles of bodies, was the final, horrifying confirmation of the evil they had served. The shame was absolute. It was in the face of this overwhelming guilt that the kindness they had been shown at Fort McClellan seemed all the more miraculous. They deserved retribution. They deserved the hatred of the world. Yet they had been given grits and butter, clean sheets, and quiet dignity. This undeserved grace was the most powerful lesson of all. It taught Anneliese that the only possible response to such a monumental crime was not to perpetuate the cycle of hatred, but to dedicate one's life to building a world where it could never happen again. The simple bowl of grits had been the first step on a long road, a journey that had taken her from the darkness of ideology to the dawn of a new, personal understanding. It had been her first taste of a different world, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she could never go back. Years melted into decades. The world moved on. The rubble of Germany was cleared away, and from the ashes rose a new, democratic nation, chastened and committed to peace. The iron cage Anneliese had expected in America eventually descended upon her homeland in the form of a wall, dividing her people for a generation. But Anneliese was living in the West, in a small, tidy home in a town that had been painstakingly rebuilt. She had married, raised children, and was now a grandmother, her hair a fine silver, her face a map of a long and complex life. One crisp autumn afternoon, her youngest granddaughter, Sophie, sat at her kitchen table, watching her with curious eyes. Anneliese was preparing something Sophie had never seen before. She was stirring a pot of white porridge on the stove, the same earthy smell that Annalise remembered from so long ago filling the small kitchen. "Oma, what are you making?" the little girl asked. "It looks strange." Annalise smiled, a gentle, distant look in her eyes. "This, my dear," she said, her voice soft, "is a taste of a very old story. This is called grits." She lifted the pot from the stove and spooned a helping into a small bowl. She added a pat of butter, a drizzle of maple syrup, a flavor she had acquired a taste for, and a sprinkle of cinnamon. She placed the bowl in front of Sophie. "This food taught me the most important lesson of my life." Sophie looked from the bowl to her grandmother's face. "What lesson, Oma?" Annalise sat down opposite her hands resting on the worn wooden table. "It taught me that the world is not what people tell you it is. It is what you see and feel and taste for yourself. When I was a young woman, I was a soldier in a terrible war. I was captured and taken to a country I had been taught to hate. I was told the people there were my enemies, that they were cruel monsters." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window, as if seeing a landscape of red earth and pine trees 60 years in the past. But they were not. They were just people. And when I was hungry and sick, one of them, a man I was supposed to despise, gave me this. It was a small thing, just a bowl of warm food. But it was the kindest gesture I had ever received. It was a moment of grace when I deserved none. She looked back at her granddaughter, her eyes shining. "That man, my enemy, he taught me that true strength is not found in weapons or in hatred. It is found in a gentle hand. It is found in sharing your bread or your grits with someone who has none." That is the lesson. That ideologies are walls, but a simple act of kindness can open a door. Sophie listened, her expression rapt. She picked up her spoon and took a tentative bite of the grits. Her eyes widened in surprise. "It's good, Oma," she said. "It's really good." Annalise's smile deepened. "Yes, my child," she said. "It is." In that small German kitchen, the cycle was complete. A food that had once been a symbol of cultural division and contempt had become a vessel for a story of reconciliation. Annalise was passing on not just a recipe, but a legacy of hope, of gratitude, and of the profound truth that the deepest enmities can be overcome, that the hardest hearts can be softened, and that sometimes the path to peace begins with the most humble and unexpected of meals. The memory of Sergeant Miller and his simple act of decency had outlasted the empires and ideologies of their time, a quiet testament to the enduring power of human connection, served warm in a bowl, a world away from where the story began. The story of Annalise and the grits of Fort McClellan is not an isolated anecdote. It is a microcosm of a larger, often overlooked chapter of the Second World War. The United States held over 425,000 German prisoners of war on its soil, in hundreds of camps scattered from coast to coast. While the experience varied from camp to camp, the overarching American policy was one of adherence to the Geneva Convention, a policy that resulted in treatment so humane it often shocked the prisoners themselves. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice, rooted in a combination of pragmatism and principle. Pragmatically, the U.S. hoped that fair treatment of German POWs would lead to better treatment for the Allied prisoners held in German camps. But on a deeper level, it was a reflection of a national identity that, even in the midst of a brutal war, refused to descend to the level of its totalitarian enemies. The American war effort was framed not merely as a struggle for territory, but as a battle for ideas: democracy over fascism, human rights over state-sponsored terror. To mistreat prisoners would have been to betray the very principles for which the nation was fighting. This led to the creation of what some German prisoners ironically called the Golden Cage. They were fed, clothed, and housed far better than their own civilian families back in a blockaded and bombed-out Germany. They had access to medical care, recreational activities, and educational programs. In some camps, prisoners could even take university-level courses. This was the re-education that the Nazi propaganda had warned them about, but it was not done through torture or brainwashing. It was done through exposure. By simply allowing the German prisoners to witness American life, its abundance, its efficiency, its freedoms, and its fundamental decency, the U.S. government waged a quiet and devastatingly effective war against the Nazi ideology. The prisoners saw that a multi-ethnic, democratic society was not weak and chaotic, but vibrant and powerful. They learned that a nation could be strong without being cruel. The story of the grits is symbolic of this broader process. Food is one of the most fundamental expressions of culture. The initial German rejection of grits was a rejection of American otherness. Their eventual acceptance was a step toward acknowledging a shared humanity. It was an admission that their preconceived notions were wrong, that something they had dismissed as inferior actually had value and could provide sustenance and comfort. Thousands of German men and women left the American POW camps at the end of the war with their entire worldview turned upside down. They returned to Germany not as bitter enemies, but as informal ambassadors for a different way of life. They had seen democracy in action, not as a theoretical concept, but in the fair-minded conduct of a camp sergeant and the simple abundance of the mess hall line. They became crucial participants in the rebuilding of a democratic West Germany. Their experiences in America providing a powerful counternarrative to both the fascist ideology of the past and the communist ideology that was descending on Eastern Europe. The final lesson, then, is one of profound and enduring hope. It demonstrates that hatred, even when cultivated and institutionalized by a powerful state, cannot survive sustained contact with basic human decency. It proves that the most effective weapon against an ideology of lies is the simple, unadorned truth. The story of the German prisoners and their American grits reminds us that reconciliation is possible, that enemies can learn to see the humanity in one another, and that sometimes the most significant historical transformations don't begin on the battlefield or at the treaty table. They begin in the quiet, unassuming places where people share a meal and discover, much to their surprise, that they are not so different after all.